Welcome to Hudson RPO's podcast on racial equality and diversity. Hear from Hudson RPO leaders as they encourage organizations to just start on their D&I journey.
All right, I'm back with Gary Jones, Mark Rogers, and Casey Butler, and I wanted to open our conversation today with a quote that I read from somebody I follow on Instagram, a 20-year-old anti-racism thought leader named Marie Beecham, who, if you're inclined to, I highly suggest you follow. But she posted something that's really sort of stuck with me as we think about how we support building a more diverse and inclusive workplace within ourselves and within our respective clients. And she wrote, "Diversity and inclusion without radical anti-racism work is reckless. Doing this alone brings Black and Indigenous people of color into a space without ensuring their safety. That shouldn't be the goal. The conversation can't end with diversity and inclusion." And so, Mark, I think this sort of speaks to a point that we had talked about previously around starting with culture before you sort of start to source diverse candidates into an organization. So I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on that sort of starting point when people, once they get past the just start and start doing the starting, where should they start?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all seen it, and the conversations online that we saw, and a lot of the dialogue was around, providing equal opportunity and, proactive identification of talent as far as people of color go. And that's where the conversation tends to gravitate towards, when you're talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, is how do we acquire talent? And I think a lot of companies have, missed the mark a little bit, and in their desire to make an immediate impact on their workforce, have looked externally. How do we acquire, people of color? How do we recruit African American talent and so forth? And they haven't done the most important work, and that is to take, an introspective look at their organization, to tap into the people already in the within their organizations, within those demographics, to understand their dynamics of their culture and what it feels to be like a person of color within their organization, and how they can evolve their culture internally before they start to, acquire, diverse talent externally. And I think what we see often, and the question is, well, why do you see this revolving door of, diverse talents coming in and out of the organization, is because just, for that very reason, companies tend to focus more on what I think is easy work, and it's not really, but identifying and, attracting the talent, as opposed to, engaging your workforce, building a culture of equity and inclusion, and then acquiring the talent.
Mm-hmm. And just, I think of an example with one of my clients, and we're talking about people with disabilities in this case. And, the mandate to the team was, go out and recruit, connect with associations that help place people with disabilities. And meanwhile, we're looking internally and we're thinking, wow, we don't even have accessible washrooms in every area of the building. Can they get through the doors? Can they, if someone was in a wheelchair? And so I think you can't just go out and find the people and then figure it out. Sometimes you have to look internally, Mark, as you were describing, to say, are we ready? What is our readiness? And if you are going to recruit, I think one of the things that we have to be open and honest with the candidates that we're talking to is, where are we in our readiness spectrum? Mm-hmm. We've done all of our work. We've looked at the culture, we've talked to our people, and, this is going to be a great experience. Or, there may be a few hiccups along the way for you. And this is, we'd love to hear, what you're thinking and what you're feeling, and how can we do better? But I think we have to be upfront and honest with candidates about that, so they know, what they're getting themselves into, so to speak.
Yeah.
And actually, that point about having an authentic conversation with candidates, I think this also speaks to something that we've talked about previously, which is, what is that balance between representation and ensuring that, that when we're speaking to diverse communities, we're speaking to them in a way that demonstrates that we understand those communities, but not tokenizing the people of color or women or whatever else to speak to those audience. What is that balance between speaking authentically to where you are in your DEI journey, which might be very early stages, and trying to ensure that there's representation of the communities that you're trying to target when you're building your interview panel or your on-campus recruitment teams. What are your thoughts on that balance? I might throw to you on that one, Gary.
Yeah, I'll go back real quick to what Mark and Casey said regarding the last comment. It's like the almost like, hey, I have black friends, or the diverse comment where, hey, listen, I'm going to throw in, a diverse recruiter, and most likely it's going to be a person of color or a minority person to help solve the diverse problem. So I echo that sentiment. But to Jeremiah, to your point, in terms of the balance that's there. We had the discussion, and we seem to have all these lively discussions that really help us prepare for this podcast. But we had a discussion regarding, just integrating, being able to reach diverse communities in what you currently do. Okay? I talk to organizations as a whole, and yeah, they are looking for diverse. I'll give an example of, their university recruitment relations. Right? They're looking for diverse candidates in their university recruitment relations. But when you look at the outreach is never to HBCUs. It's never to women's colleges, objectively. It's to the larger universities, and they're wanting to find diverse, candidates there. My urge is for them to actually go, if that's what you're searching for, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reach those communities. Go to those historically Black colleges and also women's colleges, and go find those individuals where they are, and not find them where they're not. And when you're doing that and you're doing the representation, to Casey's point, we're going there and we're being transparent with what our goal is and what our issues are. And we're doing it in a sense that we're not actually saying, hey, this is the best thing. Look, we're looking at, people of color, we're looking at minorities, and we're going to bring them straight to the top. We're talking about what our challenges are. We're looking at the skill set. We're looking at all those types of things, much like we do anyone else. And we're making those decisions. And on top of that, the people that are representing your company, by the way, it doesn't have to be women to go to women's colleges. It doesn't have to be Black folks to go to HBCUs. It's great to have that, to have that. But listen, everyone that's a part of your outreach from a TA standpoint needs to be involved with this. They need to be involved with the outreach. They need to be signed on with it. And they need to certainly make sure that they embrace the opportunity to go out and have those outreach at those things. So that's the balance that I would love to see achieved on, clients and organizations that we talk to.
Yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance. I mean, authenticity is the operative word there. I think, certain demographics, Black in particular, we're accustomed to having brands somewhat pander to us from an attraction standpoint, not necessarily from a retention and development standpoint. Mm-hmm. And so if you are putting yourself forward, it's got to be authentic. Talent will read through anything that's not. And if they don't get it before they start, they'll get it after. And then you have to deal with the repercussions of, that on your employment brand. It's a small world. It's a big world, but networks are small. They're also big and well connected. And so it's definitely a disservice to not be authentic and transparent about what your mission is, what your vision is. And then as far as framing up, the sell, if you will, I mean, I don't think it's really any different than any other demographic. It's, again, what is your mission? What is your vision? Developmentally, how are you going to help me succeed and, progress in my career? What support will you have around me from a mentorship standpoint, engagement standpoint, development, and learning standpoint, all of those things. But authenticity is clearly key. People will figure it out eventually if they don't, very quickly right away.
Yeah, and I think part of being able to be authentic is to know your stuff when you go to those events. I think you're going to get asked the question about, diversity and how it fits. If you target, a predominantly Black college or a women's college, they're going to have questions that relate to the diversity. And I think you, as the representation to your company, have to come prepared to answer those questions and really understand it. Not just, have the cookie cutter answers, but like you said, Mark, that authenticity, because otherwise, if someone asks you a question and you're not prepared, and you're in that situation, I think it doesn't reflect obviously very well on your employer brand.
Couldn't agree more, Casey. I think that that message needs to be just as powerful to your white audience as it is your diverse folks, right? So when we
Great.
go to those colleges and we're making those statements and we're making a stand to say, listen, we're recognizing that diversity is an issue, that needs to be a message across the board. As we'd mentioned, it is a total engagement, right? So you know, it just sometimes it's a situation where your diverse messages are saved for the diverse audience and not necessarily across the board. But to your point, 100%, I think you need to know your facts, and these things need to be reciprocated and certainly, you know, shared throughout all of your audience and not just your diversity of folks.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and that really leads to further to kind of the conversation we had about just the work that it goes to make DE&I work, and how it's not just, you know, one person or one department's job. It's it's an organizational effort. I would love to get into that dialogue, because I know we had a pretty passionate conversation about one, the work that organizations are doing right now and continue to do to identify people to these really big D&I jobs. And it'll just be interesting to see what comes of those appointments. It's really encouraging to see people of color and women be appointed to those jobs. But let's see how it plays out, A. And then B, the diversity recruitment jobs, and having organizations that have functions specifically dedicated to that. I think it's worthy, but framing it in the right way is an important thing. How is it integrated into the rest of the function and more broadly into the organization?
And I think that's a really important point, and sort of ties back to what we were talking about at the start of this, which is this idea that you're sort of putting diversity recruitment and a focus on diversity recruitment, like you're giving that as a strategic priority to one group of individuals, whether that's diversity recruitment, whether that's a DEI function, whether that's individual recruiters. But I think if you are in a position of saying, what are you doing to source diverse candidates into our organizations, then you're asking the wrong question. It's like you need to ask, what am I doing? And then how can these other functions support me in that effort? And so I think that also speaks to the point about authenticity and representation, and folks speaking about DEI regardless of what audience they're speaking to and what they themselves look like. And so I'm just wondering, and I'll throw this out to everyone, how do you undertake as an organization that education within your manager communities, getting them to see DEI as their responsibility and not the responsibility of recruitment or sourcing or DEI? How does everyone within an organization take ownership of DEI? I know that's a huge question, so
we're just going to solve right now all of the world's problems right now.
How long is this podcast?
So, honestly, I think that a lot of people stop at the diversity piece, and the E&I are the same size. That equity and that inclusion piece is extremely important, particularly if you want the organization to continue to perpetuate, that success. And I do think that they stop there. And I think that everyone needs to not only pay attention to the diversity or lack of diversity within their own communities, organizations, departments, but what's happening after those folks are identified and after they come on board. And that's a lot of heavy lifting from everyone, right? So the awareness is there, but then after we do that, what's the strategy? What are we doing to continue to make this place a successful, comfortable, collaborative environment that fosters DEI? And we have to separate each one of them just to explain, hey, listen, we're checking off the diversity piece, but there's still the equity, there's the inclusion piece, and here's where everyone can be strategic in that manner. So I do think that there's an assignment of roles that need to happen, because it's not clear when we just say, hey, everyone just get on the train. I think we have to have some assignment of roles and strategies so that people can understand and have it kind of drawn out to them exactly how they can impact the entire DEI strategy.
And I think it can't be driven from just HR. Like, I think it has to come from the top and trickle down, because I know we've talked a little bit about that in our previous podcast. Gary gave that example of a CEO who owned up to maybe not having the expertise and knowledge you wish he did. And so I really think it has to come from above. And, you have to know that that's a priority of the leaders. And that's important to leaders. And that it's not just going to be HR, trying to solve all these challenges alone, as Jeremiah said, hand it off to a department who's going to own this whole thing. And I think that comes from leadership.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question, Jeremiah, maybe to start with, who we're targeting. We talked about this in our first podcast, and it might have been a comment that Gary made, and in spirit of continuing to speak authentically on this topic. I think the reality is there are going to be leaders who just don't care, don't really care about and that's not the group that we're going to focus on here. But I do also think that there are others who don't realize that they have the power, within themselves, within their role in the organization, to really impact all, diversity, equity, and inclusion, by contributing to what the culture of the organization looks like within their team, obviously tapping into their network and building their network. I think that's often a challenge. So as a recruitment consultant, we always like to go into engagements with leaders and hiring managers from a consultative perspective and try to coach them on the things that they can do, such as, building your network and tapping into the people that to expand, your reach and to tap into, more diverse communities and so forth. So I think we definitely have to acknowledge just as much the people who, we want to tap into, as much as those who, just quite frankly, you're spinning your wheels and wasting your time. And I think we've seen that a lot, externally in some of the commentary that we see at an executive levels from some really big companies who feel, that, diverse talent is lacking in the marketplace, when we know that's not true. You just have to do a little bit more diligence and, different engagements to get to it.
Yeah, and on that point about sort of inclusive leaders might not know their own power, or might not know that they can be inclusive leaders. I think this speaks to the overall point that if it's everybody's responsibility, everybody sort of starts with you, and you probably have more power than you think you do, and your voice carries further than you think it does. And that once you get past that sort of psychological barrier of in this space. And once you stop accepting that it's somebody else's responsibility and accept that it's your own, then I think people might be surprised at their own ability to influence things here, because what we are talking about is a systemic issue. I think there are individual actions that everyone can take to sort of help to resolve systemic issues. And I realize we're probably coming up at the end of our allotted time, so I'll just once again thank Mark Rogers, Gary Jones, and Casey Butler for joining me, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Good.
Have a good one, folks.
See you.
To speak with any of today's participants about your Just Start journey, email juststart@hudsonrpo.com.